Hello, and welcome to the video lecture on Chapter 4, which covers extensions of demand and supply. This demand and supply model we covered in Chapter 3. All right, so to kick us off, as always, let's think about this issue here. So intermediaries, or which are basically go-between firms, specialize in matching buyers and sellers. So these are things like real estate agents, mortgage brokers, car dealers, these people that help match buyers and sellers, right? eBay is an intermediary. In contrast to the argument that the internet would liberate consumers from relying on the services of these intermediaries, there have actually been more companies that have found niches offering middleman services on the web. Middlemen or middleman is is a synonym for intermediaries. So intermediaries and middlemen are the same thing. A lot of people thought that the internet would sort of eliminate the need for real estate agents, for example. But as it turns out, there's actually been an increase in the number of intermediaries since the internet has evolved. So we will learn about in this chapter why middlemen often occupy key roles within the price system, among other things in this chapter. All right, so for our learning objectives, we will talk about the essential features of the price system in Section 1. In Section 2, maybe the most important part of this chapter, we're going to look at the effects of changes in demand and supply and what that does to market price and equilibrium quantity. Okay, so this is probably the most important section, is Section 2. In Section 3, we're going to talk about the rationing function of prices. So if you don't know what rationing is, we'll talk about what that is, but prices act as a way of rationing things. In Section 4, we will talk about the effects of price ceilings. Okay, so price ceiling is a type of control on price, usually imposed by the government. And then in Section 5, we'll talk about the effects of price floors, which are sort of the opposite of price ceilings, as well as the effects of government-imposed quantity restrictions, so restrictions on quantity by the government. Okay, so these last two sections are all about the government sort of getting its hands on the market and intervening. All right, so again, Section 1 is about the price system and markets. Section 2 is about changes in demand and supply. Section 3 is about the rationing function of prices. Section 4 is about price ceilings, and Section 5 is about price floors and quantity restrictions. All right, so did you know that every year since 2011, there have been shortages that have persisted for about 300 pharmaceutical manufactured for diverse purposes? So there have been various laws preventing prices from rising sufficiently to eliminate those shortages for those pharmaceuticals, and for which this usually involves government programs like Medicare and Medicaid, where these restrictions take place. So basically, these laws effectively generate legally binding price ceilings that lead to these shortages. Okay, so that's going to be one thing we talk about in this chapter. That's a real life example of economics at work. Okay, so in this first section here, we're going to talk about price systems, sometimes also called market systems. This is simply an economic system in which relative prices are constantly changing all the time at every instance. And these relative price changes are reflecting the changes in supply and demand. And so what's really going on is that the prices are acting as a signal, kind of like a traffic light or a stop sign is a signal, right? Telling people what they should do in their best interest, right? So if you see a red light, it's in your best interest to stop, because if you don't stop, you might get hit and get injured or killed, right? So just like stop signals and traffic signals directing you what to do to provide you with what's in your best interest, prices do the same thing. They act as signals as to what is relatively scarce, what there's not a lot of, and what is relatively abundant, where there is more than some other things, right? So water is relatively abundant. Diamonds are relatively scarce, for example. Now, both are overall scarce, right? There's not unlimited water in the universe. So water is scarce, but relative to diamonds, it's abundant, right? Now, prices act as signals telling us, they give us information, both buyers and individuals and buyers, as well as businesses. And again, the signals are acting, they're telling individuals and businesses what to do to pursue their best interest. Okay, so that's how they act as signals, and that's the nature of a price system, right? Another important aspect about price systems and markets is voluntary exchange, right? So the act of trading between individuals within a price system or within a market system, and it's very important that it's voluntary, right? People are doing it out of their own free will; they're not being coerced or forced. And the important thing going on behind the scenes, sort of, or underlying the voluntary exchange, the reason it's voluntary is because it ends up making both parties better off subjectively. Okay, so in the parties' own minds, they're better off, right? That's subjectively better off, and that's why they are willing to do it. That's why it's voluntary for them. They don't have to be forced. They're aware that if they engage in trade, they will be better off. So that's why anybody trades anything, right? If I go buy an energy drink at Quick Trip, the price that I'm giving Quick Trip, they want the money at that price, and I want the energy drink at that price, and both sides are benefiting, and that's why we voluntarily exchange money for the energy drink, right? So that's an important aspect of markets and price systems. Another important aspect of price systems and markets are the costs involved with being able to transact, right? So transaction costs, the costs associated with the exchange. So this can be a number of things, right? This could be the cost of finding out, getting information about the price, getting information about the quality, or the service record, or the durability of a product, right? So a lot of times we use rules of thumb to sort of go through these things, but think about when you're at a restaurant trying to decide what to order, right? That time and effort you spend trying to figure out what to order, that's part of the transaction cost, right? So keep in mind too, as we continue forward here, that not all costs and not all benefits are necessarily expressed in terms of money, although they usually can be converted into an expression of money. They aren't always, right? So you sitting at a restaurant and looking at a menu, taking your time to figure out what to order, that's a cost in terms of your time and maybe also in terms of your mental effort. But it's not money, right? But it's still a cost, okay? Some other examples of transaction costs could be contracts, right? So many transactions and exchanges between businesses and businesses and consumers, and actually usually businesses and other businesses. Those exchanges typically involve contracts, and it's costly to make those contracts. It's also costly to enforce the contract in the event that either side does not abide by the contract. Okay, so contract costs are also part of transaction costs. Anything associated with the exchange that isn't part of the price. All right, so let's get back to the role of middlemen, right? So middlemen or intermediaries, or sometimes called brokers, they exist because they can help reduce transaction costs by providing information to buyers and sellers, or by having pre-made contracts that have been tested They're pre-made, so they don't have to be written, so that saves on costs. And usually those contracts that are pre-written also have sort of stood the test of time and have been cheaper to enforce. Okay, so that's the point of middlemen, is to reduce transaction costs, right? Something sort of related to middlemen or intermediaries are platform firms. So these are companies who it's their service to link people to other individuals to share their interests, or who seek to buy firms' products. And it's usually through some sort of network, like maybe a social network or some other kind of network. And it's usually a network that the companies operate, the platform firms themselves. So Amazon really is an example of a platform firm. Facebook is also an example of a platform firm, somewhat related to middlemen, although not necessarily the same thing. Okay, so here's an interesting behavioral example. So online dating sites and virtual roses. So there have been some online dating companies that provide each customer with a small number of virtual roses or something similar. Not, I think that in some dating apps, it's like you can have a super like, right? You have a limited number of super likes. So that's kind of the same thing here as virtual rose that you can send to the invitations to date other customers. And having these roses, these digital roses, has induced or created a 20% increase in the date acceptance rate, as the people that are receiving these digital roses take this as an indication that the person trying to reach out to them is serious. They have a serious interest, and it's because they know that the sender only has a limited number of these digital roses, and so they're going to be careful about who they send them to, and only send them to the people that are that they're most interested in. So, pretty interesting behavioral example with some real world empirical data there to help us think about these issues. All right, so that was section 1 of chapter 4. I'll see you in the next video for section 2.